Hi there, I'm Dr. James Waldron, a portfolio GP based in Nottingham. I'm a GP educator and co-host of the GP Notebook study groups. Welcome to the GP Notebook podcast. Here we bring you a diverse array of concise topics tailored for those immersed in primary care every single week. Whether you're on your morning commute or anywhere else, our episodes are designed to inform and engage you on important topics. You can easily access us on all major podcast platforms. Be sure to follow us for updates on new episodes, and if you enjoy what you hear, kindly leave a review to assist others in discovering our content. Connect with us on X at GP Notebook for updates on podcasts, study groups and more, and you can also follow me at Jammiest Dodgers. Lastly, explore the show notes and navigate through our newly revamped GP Notebook website. Discover information on joining our study groups and explore a wealth of educational resources. Today, I'll be talking to Hayley Wilson, Consent and Sexual Violence Development Officer for Nottingham Trent University, about the vital and complex topic of sexual violence. We'll be looking at its prevalence, context, and how our approach in primary care can make a big difference to a patient's journey. Due to the nature of the topic today, it may be particularly emotive for some listeners. Please see the podcast notes for links to support and further resources. Right, well, welcome Hayley. It's really nice to have you. First off, can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Hi James, thanks for having me. So I am currently working at Nottingham Trent University as the Consent and Sexual Violence Development Officer. And primarily in my role, I look after our consent programme, which is delivered to all the students at the university, but also the general kind of sexual violence development work, so making sure that the university and the students are aware of sexual violence and kind of working on the prevention side of things as well.
Oh, wonderful. I mean, that is a very, very important and very topical role, considering the demographic that you serve. What led you to get into this line of work?
So I actually started out working within mental health. So I've kind of had a bit of a journey where I was initially working with people struggling with their mental health. And then from there, I noticed I was getting a lot of patients who would be struggling with sort of mental health needs, but also this was usually as a result of some sexual violence as well. So there was a bit of a crossover. And that really escalated my interest in sexual violence and the impact of it and how we as a society respond to it and what we do kind of preventative-wise. From there, I then started working for a sexual violence specific charity. And that was really eye-opening and taught me a lot of what I know now. And then I later went on to work for a local council to help develop their violence against women and girls strategy. So I've kind of had a few different hats on in the last kind of 5 years or so. But they've each taught me a very different aspect of, how we, as I say, as a society look at sexual violence.
And it's quite interesting, I think a lot of our listeners will be hearing the word sexual violence, and it's a really emotive sort of topic, and one that we probably find it quite difficult to talk about and think about, but something that should be part of our everyday practice, thinking about it at least, in primary care. I mean, so what do we mean by sexual violence? Because I think for a lot of people, sexual violence in our minds we would think rape, but I understand it encompasses a lot of other things.
Yeah, and you touched on something really important there about it kind of being a very emotive phrase and kind of terminology. And I think the term sexual violence sometimes does add to that because we think of sexual violence and violence particularly as being something where, it's very physical, it's very violent, and then that kind of clouds what we feel sexual violence is as a whole. And a lot of people do kind of perceive sexual violence to solely mean things like rape or very, very violent physical kind of sexual abuse. Actually, it's a very large umbrella term for all kinds of sexual assault and sexual abuse, and that includes things like image-based sexual abuse. It includes coercive control in a sexual way, all kinds of sexual assault, like grabbing, groping, catcalling, all these kind of things. They fall under that umbrella. And we find we use the word violence often because it's actually kind of alluding to the violation of someone's sexual rights and their autonomy. But it can be a very, very difficult phrase to get your head around because, as I say, it does lead you to think of that kind of physical violence rather than the violation aspect.
I think it's really helpful to know that breadth of term is what we're talking about when we're thinking about sexual violence. I suspect, though, that because of that lack of understanding, it can be quite difficult to respond to it as a professional, but also actually to identify when it's happening to you. Do you have some of the stats around people reporting sexual violence or people that experience it? Because I understand it's a lot higher than people would expect.
It's a very underreported crime. We actually estimate that around 16.6% of adults aged 16 or over have experienced sexual violence or assault since they turned 16.
Oh, gosh.
So that's 7.9 million in the UK, which when you think about it on that scale, is huge.
Yeah.
But we don't see that in the reports to the police or the criminal justice service because there is a lot of stigma around sexual violence and how it's going to be sort of responded to by kind of health practitioners or by friends, family, and all these things make it really difficult for survivors to be able to come forward and disclose what's happened to them, as well as an understanding about what's actually happened to them, like you've already said.
Okay. I mean, being that it's so prevalent and being that GPs see millions of patients every week, or at least I think it's millions of patients, it certainly feels like that. We're going to be encountering patients that either are disclosing or not disclosing that. Why do you think it's so important that we as general practitioners understand this topic a lot better?
Well, I think it's really important, one, not just to understand it, but also to kind of be comfortable. I know that sounds a bit strange, but to feel comfortable actually talking about it. Because I think one of the things that kind of creates the stigma is that everyone's a little bit afraid to talk about sexual violence. It feels still very taboo. So I think, gaining that understanding about what sexual violence is helps you to gain that confidence in being able to talk about it and identify it. And if you as a practitioner, as a GP, are able to kind of see the signs or to pick up on when someone's saying that something happened and you think, that doesn't sound right, that doesn't sound like consensual relations, that sounds like rape just because it's with a partner or something, and you have that confidence to pick up on it and actually maybe verbalise some of those things, then that survivor or victim can feel heard and may feel someone's actually paying attention, notices what's happened to them, even if they haven't noticed it themselves.
Yeah, I think that feeling of being heard is really powerful. And when we talked about this before, when we were discussing about this podcast, you're saying that one of the most powerful and helpful things we can do is listen and really hear a patient when they make a disclosure, or at least help to understand what impact it might be having on them. I think in terms of what I suppose I understood before we started talking about this, it can be a little bit difficult to discern sexual violence from domestic violence. Just to help for our listeners to help unpick those two terms, what is the difference between those two things?
I think they can be very difficult topics to unpick because there is a lot of crossover between domestic violence and sexual violence. For example, if somebody discloses they have been raped by their partner, that would also fall under domestic violence. Also a family member as well, that would also fall under domestic violence. So I think that's where the kind of confusion can be, because they can be the same thing in the same situation, for example. But I guess where sexual violence differs is that sexual violence can be committed by somebody that's obviously not a partner or a family member, and then it would not fall under the domestic violence umbrella.
That does make an awful lot of sense. Yeah, I think that because when we get teaching, it's not necessarily differentiated between the two. This idea of I suppose putting it in a cultural context, in the family context, I think is also quite important. I think our understanding, fortunately, as society around this topic has really grown, but it can cause a lot of problems when we're trying to identify it. Are there any particular cultural elements that we might think about when it comes to identifying and helping people with sexual violence, particularly from the context of universities, which is obviously the area you work in?
Yeah, so I think, you touched on an important word there on context, and I think sometimes we've seen kind of instances of sexual violence in kind of movies and in media and things like that, and it might be, for example, the hero grabbing the heroine and kissing her, and it's very dramatic and passionate and that kind of thing. We don't often see kind of consent being spoken about or kind of given in movies and media, and I think that gives people an idea that that's how relationships play out and that's how kind of sexual actions happen. And I think particularly we see that with our kind of demographic of university students, because they don't have prior experience, as much prior experience to call upon, and they may be coming to a new city, for example, and having new experiences like going to clubs, drinking, living away from family for the first time, and all of these kind of factors might lead them to explore, their sexuality but without the prior knowledge of what consent is and what sexual violence is, that's when these kind of things can happen. So a lot of what work we do at the university is consent education, because a lot of the time they actually just don't know what is consensual and what isn't. And that's okay, like that's why we teach it. But I think that's a really important thing to kind of recognise, is that we've historically, the landscape of consent has changed over the years. And historically, what we've thought of as consensual from media and from kind of things that we've seen, we now know isn't consensual. So that's a constantly evolving landscape. And I think even older people as well are kind of learning, oh, actually, that's not okay. And that actually might come under the kind of umbrella of sexual violence now.
Yeah, I think understanding that as a society, I think it's happening bit by bit. Certainly you see much more of that in media, which is really nice. And looking at older films where we have that, as you mentioned, that sort of passionate kiss, I suppose that's romanticised in people's heads, but in reality it's it is non-consensual, and thus shouldn't necessarily be a role model for young people who are discovering about themselves. You've obviously mentioned that the teaching, the training you've been doing at university. Could you explain to me a little bit more about how that goes?
Yeah, so the basis of the workshops is primarily to kind of give a basic understanding about what consent is and how we can practice it in sort of everyday situations and life. And we do also talk a little bit about non-sexual situations in which we use consent. And I think people sometimes automatically put consent, with sex and sexual relationships, but actually we practice consent in pretty much everything we do, and it doesn't feel as taboo when we do it. Then I wouldn't just kind of walk into a restaurant and take food off someone's plate, because that would be weird. But if you were eating dinner with a friend, you might say, oh, can I have a chip? And that would be the giving and receiving of consent, in a kind of very normalised way. So we talk a lot about that and how we do practice consent every day in those kind of situations. And then we look through scenarios in which, we discuss, is consent there, is consent not there? And we get students to kind of really think about it. And for the most part, students are really good. I think they're really starting to identify, I think, there's a lot of consent education now in kind of secondary schools and things. Yeah. So they're really able to identify situations that aren't consensual. But there's still a real lack of knowledge around things like alcohol and drug usage and how that feeds into consent, or kind of maybe interacts with someone's ability to give consent. I think as well, the kind of crimes around like image-based sexual abuse, people still really don't know much about. Yeah. And I think that kind of comes into this idea that there's a bit of a hierarchy around sexual violence, and so we don't think about maybe the things that people consider as not as criminalised as rape and things, so we don't kind of pay them enough attention, but they are just as impactful to the survivor. Yeah.
And you mentioned this image-based sexual violence as well, a big and complicated, very modern topic in itself, and I'm happy to say we're going to talk about that in a lot more detail in a future podcast. I want to pick up on the word you used there around about hierarchy of sexual violence. Can you unpick that a little bit as a term?
Yeah, so I think I use the word hierarchy not because I personally believe, and obviously I don't think any practitioners in the field believe, that there is an actual hierarchy of sexual violence. I personally believe that all forms of sexual violence are just as bad and impactful to the survivor and victim. I think it becomes difficult because, as you said earlier on when we were speaking, primarily when you think of sexual violence, you think of rape and very physically sort of aggressive or violent crimes. And you maybe don't think so much about the things I've just mentioned, like image-based sexual abuse or groping or catcalling, things like that. And I think that's a societal thing as well. I think in society we have a bit of a subconscious hierarchy about what type of sexual violence is worse, and we respond to those types differently. So for the most part, I think a lot of people who had a friend or a family member that said, I've been subjected to rape, they would be very shocked, maybe upset, want to help, think it's really serious. And then if someone, for example, said, I had someone grab my bum in a nightclub, someone would be like, oh, how was it? There's a very different response to that. But, both of those people may still feel violated, and that might be really impactful for them. But the response differs. And I think that that's something that is very prevalent in society, in that because we think of them as less or more serious, we respond very differently to them. And then because of that response that we give those survivors or victims, they may not then think of it as sexual violence or seek support, and they kind of internalize those things that have happened to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really powerful way of looking at it. I mean, it's quite easy for us to understand how awful rape or very physical sexual violence might be, but I suppose with the other types you've been talking, there's almost a death of 1,000 cuts type thing, and things that will plague people and cause people untold misery throughout their lives, especially if it's normalised. And it's really good that we're taking steps away from that, and that young people in universities are starting to understand that. So I think if we educate the young well, moving forwards, we're just going to be living in a much better society where this isn't the norm.
Yeah,
it isn't
definitely.
normality. So, because it is so prevalent, and because so many people are going to be experiencing this, unfortunately, in their lives, why is it that it doesn't come to our attention so frequently? What does bring people in with sexual violence issues, and what stops people telling their health practitioner or other people about it?
I think obviously, for the most part, a lot of people will come forward because that obviously they recognise that something has happened to them. That's obviously a big factor, and then they obviously want justice. Completely natural, completely understandable. I think what we often see, and I think it is probably one of the most underreported crimes in the UK, and there will be a statistic about that, I'm sure you can find, is that often what will happen is, a trusted person to that survivor or victim, like the GP or like a family member, may receive that disclosure and won't know how to respond to it. And then because they may not have responded in the best way, that survivor or victim may not then want to proceed with criminal justice proceedings. That is something that happens a lot. We do also then often see, that they have a really great response from a GP or from whoever they speak to, and they go to the police or the criminal justice service, and that's where then it falls down and they don't get the conviction or don't get taken to court. I think the conviction rate for sexual violence cases that have actually been reported is something around the 2% mark. It's incredibly low. And that is often because, there has to be enough evidence to prove that it happened, and that evidential data is just so incredibly difficult to gather and to maintain. A lot of survivors don't understand or know what they need to do to record that evidence as well, and that's no fault to them at all, but it'll be things like, if they've been raped, the first thing they will want to do is to shower, change their clothes, all of those kind of things, but they actually get rid of evidence, and then that makes kind of prosecuting very difficult. So they're of course all very logistical reasons as to why people may not report, or people don't kind of get as far as they would like to in the reporting process. But I think one of the major things that stops people reporting is the kind of societal norms around sexual violence. I think there's a lot of shame and embarrassment and a stigma around being a survivor or victim of sexual violence. The way that we talk about it is very victim focused. So often we will talk about things like what the victim was wearing, where they were, had they been drinking. There's a lot of scrutiny on that survivor victim, and very much less so on the perpetrator or alleged perpetrator. And so a victim survivor may kind of think, okay, well, I've been subjected to this form of sexual violence. It's right to report it to the police or report it to whoever, but I know as soon as I do that, they're going to go through my records, they're going to go through, my whole actions and my behaviour. Do I want to be placed under that scrutiny? Probably not. So they probably won't do it, especially when they know, for the most part, that there is a very low conviction rate. Why would you put yourself through that scrutiny? So I think that's definitely a huge factor in why survivors and victims don't report. I think as well, lack of support from family and friends. It's not just society generally that kind of has a stigma. I think when you tell a friend or a family member that it's happened to you, you don't know what that response is going to be. And there might be kind of some beliefs in which there's shame put on that person for allowing themselves to be kind of a victim or survivor of sexual violence. So there's all kind of reasons in that sense. But then also in kind of very sort of basic terms and logistical terms, you've got things like, if it's your partner that has been the perpetrator, you might rely on them for the house over your head, or for finances, or you might have a child with them. You might be their carer, or vice versa. There's so many reasons in that sense as to why people don't report as well. And I think it's it's kind of being quite ignorant, I guess, to say, oh, they should just report it to the police without really kind of thinking about those reasons why they won't and the barriers that a lot of people face. We also know, for example, that disabled people are far more likely to be victims and survivors of sexual violence than able-bodied people. So think about that. Why would a disabled person not want to go to the police? You know, there's all kinds of reasons why particularly marginalised communities may not want to go to the police. You know, there's different marginalised communities or people of different ethnic backgrounds that have, you know, a very difficult past with the police, and they don't want to kind of go back there because of fear of being disbelieved. There's this huge spectrum of reasons, and I think it's really important to be aware of that and really think about that when you are receiving a disclosure, because the journey that person has taken just to say it to you as the GP has probably been immense, and how you respond to that can then change the course of their life or how they think about what's happened to them. So I think it's an incredibly important role that you will have in that person's life, essentially, when you receive that disclosure.
That's I think a really good thing to hear, and especially because as GPs we are often pivotal points in a lot of their healthcare journey, and just to understand how much of an impact we can have here is really good to hear. I want to finish on how we can do things better, but just before we move on to that, I've noticed that you've used the word victim survivor sort of together. In fact, not interchangeably, but together. We talked about this a little bit before. Why is that? Why is the
So I always try and use the terminology victim survivor when referring to people who have been subjected to sexual violence, because from working with them kind of one-to-one, I know that some people want to be referred to as victims because they have been a victim to sexual violence. It's happened to them. They are a victim in that sense. Whereas other people want to be referred to as survivors. You know, they have survived that experience, what they've been subjected to, and it helps empower them if it makes them feel stronger. But everybody has their individual needs and differences, and I think it's really important, again, like when you are working one-to-one with people who've been subjected to this, to understand how they want to be talked about, because again, like I had, and it always sticks with me, I had someone say to me, no, don't call me a survivor. Like, it makes me sound like I've got cancer and I've survived. I'm not a survivor. I'm a victim of this awful thing. And I want you to kind of pay it due diligence. And I'm like, okay, that's fair. I understand that. And that's why I always try and use that terminology. I just think it's respectful to, this demographic of people.
Yeah. And we're going to explore terminology and language used in a lot more detail in our second podcast about responding to disclosures. So I think what would be very helpful in sort of the final few minutes of today's podcast is, how do you think that we can do better? What is it that we in general practice could do better, if you were to leave us with a few bits of advice?
I think a really good place to start is to just challenge yourself and your unconscious biases and maybe what you don't know or you think you know. I think, when we've spoken previously, we discussed kind of unconscious bias and, those kind of thinking that sexual violence was a very violent act. So kind of challenging those kind of belief systems that you might have, doing the research, looking up, how prevalent this is, why there might be communities that find it even more difficult to come forward, what those kind of rape myths are around, whether it's a person in a dark alley that's a stranger, that's a very strong rape myth that we hear talked about a lot, but we actually know is untrue, and it's usually somebody that, is known to the survivor victim. So I guess that would probably be my first kind of call to action, really, is to think about, what you actually know about sexual violence and challenge yourself to look that up, to research it, to understand if that's right and what work you have to do as a person to kind of maybe learn more.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think education and updating ourselves on this particular topic is so important, and hopefully people listening today have learned a few little nuggets, in fact many nuggets of information around this super important topic, and thinking about it more deeply. Now I'm really happy to say that we're going to have another podcast, in fact maybe another couple of these, and the next one we're going to be talking about how to respond to a disclosure, the language used, and some of the things around that. And I think in the final one we're going to look at some specific cases of I suppose more challenging, more modern ones, particularly around image-based sexual violence, and explore a little bit more around young people as well. So thank you so much, Hayley. It's been absolutely wonderful talking to you today, and really looking forward to the next podcast. So thank you very much.
No, thank you.
So thank you all for listening. We hope you found this podcast helpful. More info and links for this episode can be found at gpnotebookpodcast.com, and if you enjoyed it, please don't forget to follow us and perhaps leave a like and a review. You can get in touch with us on social media at GPnotebook or email us if you have any questions, comments or ideas for future podcasts. Head on to our brand new website to register for our virtual GP Notebook study groups and download free resources and shortcuts to help improve the lives of our patients in primary care.